Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Inside Job. Okay, so this episode is very much about Brett. Brett is the central character in this episode. This episode is very much about him. But, yeah, and I'll kind of get to that in a minute. But, in case the episode opens up with Brett being in a family meal with his family, and I'm not going to picture them because I'll get to that in a minute. But, in any case, he's sitting down for a family meal with his family, and then we find out that he's actually just in a pretendo deck type situation. As it turns out, he was using it to get in contact with his family, and kind of made a homegrown meal, and it's at this point where Reagan comes in and shuts down the whole thing and startles him, and then proceeds to tell him that he can't be using the pretendo deck like that. That it's meant for training simulations, pretty much almost exclusively. Although people use it anyway, as we find out. But Brett points out that obviously it's not really his fault, and that work has been keeping him pretty busy. And in order to actually kind of connect with and then he points out that he needs to just have a family dinner every now and then inside the pretendo deck because he's been missing out on a lot of those at home. And this causes Reagan to become very confused because as she points out, she believed that home family meals were something made up by greeting card companies alongside Santa Claus and a couple other things. But Brett merely points out that actually it is in fact a real thing, and he does point out that obviously he feels like people don't really connect face to face much anymore. Case in point, a hologram of JR then proceeds to appear inside the pretendo deck, and then tells him to quit screwing around in there, and also refers to it as a sex deck, and also wonders if they've been going through his sex deck history, which of course Reagan and Brett reassure him they have not. They proceed to get pulled, but in case he then proceeds to tell them that he's got an important assignment for them, and that he needs them there in 5 minutes. At which point he shuts off the hologram, and they then proceed to actually look through his sex deck history, and with Reagan pointing out that they have 5 minutes. In case they then proceed to go into the conference room where JR then proceeds to pull out a bunch of old 80s crap, which he just kind of pours that onto the table. And Gigi, of course, is the first one to notice that everything is a little bit weird and points out that there's a lot of borderline dangerous things in there. Lawn darts, for example, perfect example, because the reason lawn darts are no longer used for the simple fact that they're just way too sharp. Could have easily put something through your foot, and that was very dangerous. That's why we kind of got lawn darts recalled. And that's a running thing. All the things in the boxes are all recalled products. And of course JR accidentally demonstrates why lawn darts are dangerous when he puts one through his hands, but he then proceeds to point out that this is actually the topic of today's assignment, and then proceeds to reveal why he gave them all this 80s crap. As it turns out, there's actually a town called Still Valley in Wyoming, which, as we find out, was kind of wiped with chemical trails to actually kind of induce a mind wipe. But what we find out is that it worked a little bit too well, and they're permanently stuck in the 80s, which, of course, works out because it means they can sell all of their recalled stuff and sell it to a new market, which, of course, Reagan points out is just radically unethical, and but JR just kind of points out it is quite radical indeed, and puts on a pair of bad sunglasses, which just causes vision to become blurry, and he puts them away. But he then proceeds to tell them that he's actually going to be taking them on a bit of a routine trip, and that they're actually just going to go, and that he's just going to send them on the routine of chemical dumping, and then also sell them all of the new products, since that's what the main market is for that. But And of course, everybody is annoyed, and of course, everybody is a little, and of course, Brett Point decides that they should actually get into character, and that if they want to do that, they should actually all just unplug and connect face to face on this trip, which all the other department heads groan at because they actually like having all of their stuff. But of course, Reagan quickly points out that Brett, for once, has a point. She points out that if they're seen on modern devices, it'll scare a lot of people, because obviously it'll break their cover, it'll break a decades-long operation, and they can't really have that. So she then proceeds to turn on all of her robots, all of her little robot arms that she has in the building, and snatches away everybody's phone, and also snatches away several of Gigi's other electronic devices. With her becoming very angry with the robot arms, and tells them that she knows where it lives in the walls. At which point they all proceed to board the plane, and Brett is currently dressed up in an 80s era outfit. So he's very dressed up. He's all dressed up, and he knows that it's all very nostalgic, and of course everybody else comments as well. But Gigi even pointing out that she feels like that she remembers a lot of these things from she was a kid. Although she also points out that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for Brett to be nostalgic for the 80s, since obviously he grew up in the 90s. He was not an 80s kid, but he also points out that he was actually and feels like he was an older soul, and also proceeds to point out that they always did feel like he was an 80s kid, and that he was an 80s kid at heart. But Reagan also proceeds to point out that they shouldn't get nostalgic, and also points out that she doesn't, and also reveals that her family life was apparently very terrible, to the point, I mean, obviously, since Rand is her father, but she points out that on one particular occasion, Rand decided that the best way for Reagan to actually focus and double down on science was to chuck out the TV, so she never grew up with any of the television stuff that all of her friends like. So, for quite literally, she's not able to get any of their references because she did not watch any of the shows they watched. And that winds up becoming a recurring joke for most of the episode. Because she hasn't seen any 80s era, shows and didn't really have a childhood, she, throughout the joke, throughout the episode, every time somebody makes an 80s reference, she just does not get it. And even herself makes a couple of references, but doesn't fully understand them either. But in any case, she also points out that the scientific reason why nostalgia is bad, and that's and this is a very true thing, but the way she points it is that we actually idealize a thing from our childhood when it wasn't actually all that better. Sometimes, I mean, there are occasions where you go back to revisit something from your childhood and it was like, oh yeah, this is cool, I liked this, and I can understand why I like this. But then there are a couple of things where you grow up and it was like, and then you watch it as an adult and are like, why was this a thing I liked? It's one of those things. I have a couple of those, not many, but I'm mostly just a sponge that likes everything. So yeah, there are a couple of things I don't like, but for the most part, not really. There's not a whole lot I don't like. So yeah, that's why I cover so much on my channel. That's it. But my case with that, but as they're all commenting on this, Mike is the one who actually comes out dressed in 80s gear as well. And Brett is actually happy that there's somebody else that decided to commit to the bit. But and of course, Mike just kind of casually points out that yeah, he likes all this 80s crap. But then we hear a vibration coming from one of his tentacles, wrists, one of those things. But and Brett realizes pretty quickly that Mike must have slipped some modern day tech onto the trip, and but Mike tells him that that's absurd, and that he had, and then proceeds to point out that he would lie to Brett, but he doesn't care enough to hurt his feelings. So he then proceeds to tuck himself behind the chemical bins, and then proceeds to pull up Twitter and tells them that the hate-filled strangers are his only friends, which yeah, it's Twitter. If you've never been on Twitter, you can connect with people on there, but for the most part, it's just people who are, well, idiots, and they or rather, really, really, really awful people sometimes. Because some people are like, well, we gotta make a point for all the people who want to be represented, or to be exact opposite, people who are just very horribly phobic of some kind, like transphobic, fatphobic, whatever the hell. either people are just really aggressively progressive, or they're really aggressively not, and it is just a mess. But yeah, in any case, it's at this point where Reagan points out that they're actually ready to get ready to dump the chemicals, and proceeds to open the bay door. At which point Brett hosts a toast, saying that he's very happy to have actually be there with everybody, and that regardless of whether or not should they go on to whatever happens, that he hopes that they will be able to stick through it together. And sure enough, as he's saying this, of course, Mike, who is currently hiding behind the chemicals to kind of play on his Apple Watch, he actually winds up setting off the. He winds up actually getting dumped out of the thing alongside the chemicals, and winds up hitting his head. At which point he winds up getting stuck in a parody of E.T. Where we actually meet a group of kids collectively called the Summer Friends, who are all, of course, very much supposed to be a parody of the kid from E.T., Elliot. But yeah, and of course they immediately scoop up. They immediately see Mike, who has since hit his head and has actually lost his memory, and the gang decides to bring him back to the leader's house, and whose name I forget. I know all the other kids, but I want to say it's Kevin. I want to say it's Kevin, but in case Kevin decides to bring the kid back to him back to the house, and presuming that he's an alien, and decide to actually keep him safe from the government, unaware that he's actually a government agent, and of course they believe, because Mike doesn't really remember anything other than his own inflated self-worth, and also the fact that he was pricked a lot, which references the fact that he hates pretty much everybody around him. They think he's been experimented on, and they drag him off. They drag him off to his house. And of course, it's at this point where Reagan and the rest of the department heads they touch down in their plane to try and look for Mike, and they conclude that he should still be there. But obviously he's not, and of course she points out and of course Glenn is the first one to point out that Mike has seen that there's actually bike tracks, and that they seem to have been and it seems that whoever was there, it was obviously kids, judging by the size, but he concludes that kids must have dragged Mike away, and they quickly realize they're doing an ET. Reagan quickly points out that they're literally government agents looking for an alien in an 80s suburbia, which of course frustrates her a little bit, but it of course concludes that they're going to have to figure out a way to actually find Mike. Wonders what the most intelligent piece of technology they have, but since the only thing they currently have is a Simon Says that Andre is currently playing with, she decides that's better than nothing, and opens it up and turns it into a drone, and that tells it to find Mike, which it doesn't. It winds up going to go look for him, but then gets attacked by an 80s owl, which of course Reagan becomes frustrated and upset with, and says that global warming will take care of it. At which point she points out that they're going to need to find another planet, and you're going to have to go look for Mike personally. And of course points out that obviously they need to do it quickly, because if Mike is discovered, it'll blow up a huge operation for them. They're never going to be able to find them, or if they don't find him soon, it'll cause problems, and they'll have to waste an entire town. Which she points out that nobody will want that, except obviously Glenn, because Glenn is, well, he's very much that kind of person. He would absolutely cleanse an entire town just to keep a government secret safe. He would absolutely do that. And sure enough, he pulls out a homemade flamethrower and says that he's just keeping their options open. In case they then proceed to go into town, and of course it quickly becomes apparent that they just kind of stick out a little bit like sore thumbs. They walk out and they immediately start looking around, and it's at this point where they're actually pulled over by cops who are of course very confused as to who they are, and while nobody really knows how to respond to the cops, Brett eventually covers it up by claiming that they're all a huge family. Because obviously they're new people to town, but they're a new family that just moved there. And of course, Reagan is confused as to what Brett is doing, but Brett whispers that it's all part of his plan, that they're going to actually blend in as a family, as an undercover, and that will give them the perfect opportunity to look for Mike. And And of course, they conclude that Mike is, and of course, the cops kind of sort of overhear this and point out that they do buy it, and then tells them that they that they hope they like the 80s because that's what the temperature is going to be pretty much the entire time. At which point they get back in their cop car and leave, and it's at this point where they start referring themselves, where they start buying the town, buying all the money buying a house that they need using the money in their pocket, and what we find out is that apparently it's just very easy, and Andre wonders why millennials are so angry, why boomers are always so angry, and Glenn points out that he doesn't really know either, or rather angrily as he points out, but in case it's at this point where Brett then proceeds to point out that they're just going to be like a one big happy family, and then decides to actually give everybody their assigned roles, and of course Glenn finds out that he's going to be a substitute teacher, which and also the father of the group, which of course Glenn is happy about because he thinks it's going to be a Guantanamo for kids, which makes him very happy. While Gigi is going to be the mom, she's going to be the leader of the group, and she's going to be the mom. She's going to go into the news station and help take things up that way. And obviously since Gigi has a background in that and government cover-ups and news conspiracies and stuff like that, obviously she's a perfect role for that. And then Andre is going to become a Chinese food shop owner, which he isn't very happy about because it's very, very racist. And then Brett concludes that he and Reagan will actually be fraternal twins, which she isn't fully happy about. But she points out that it has whatever they need to do to actually find Mike. And then everybody breaks to go look for their respective things. And it's at this point where, they perceive that they should go out into town to look for them. But Brett concludes that they're actually going to go out into the mall. They're going to go out to the mall and look there. So he then proceeds to bring Reagan and Andre with him, and Andre clearly does not have a very interesting time. But I'll get to that in a minute. But in case, it then proceeds to cut back to the house where after Kevin's mom leaves. They then proceed to pull, and very much in a parody of E.T., he hides in the plushie pile. But they pull Mike out of the plushie pile, and then proceed to all introduce themselves. Obviously we've got Kevin, who is the leader of the group, and then you've also got Charlie, who is a girl with a boy's name, Ashley, who is a boy with a girl's name, and then a kid named Lamar, who, as we find out, he's a big O.J. Simpson fan, but we find, and he requests that people call him OG, but for obvious reasons, and Mike doesn't fully understand those reasons, but he's kind of somewhat remembers that it's not a good connotation, so he decides to refrain from doing that. At which point Mike's Apple Watch then proceeds to go off, and it tells him that he needs to redo his subscriptions for a couple of his porn sites that he watches, and of course the kids see this and conclude that it must be some sort of technology that enables him to communicate with his home planet, which they conclude that is obviously very advanced, far more advanced than anything they have. But actually, it's just an Apple Watch. It's a smartwatch. We have these now. This is obviously a thing. Obviously, people don't if they think it's the 80s and they don't understand. But we know it's an Apple Watch. We know what it is. The kids don't, but we do. In case they then proceed to sit down with the kid. They then proceed to sit down with Mike and try to figure out who he is and where he came from. But Mike doesn't really have any sort of memories. Again, he thinks something's coming to him, but he just sits down and decides to take another drink and asks if the hot mom is still around, which of course she is, and also concludes that it seems to be some sort of divorce type, shared custody type situation, which causes Kevin to become annoyed. But in case also, Brett then proceeds to bring Reagan and Andre with him to the mall. Andre is trying to pick up girls and flirt with them, but what we find out is that is that they apparently have never been with a quote-unquote Oriental, which he starts wondering if she's hot enough to actually get away with saying something like that. And they then proceed to ask him his name, and he tries to refer to himself as a doctor, but then he remembers it's the 80s and that there aren't any established Asian doctors yet. So he decides to look around for an appropriate Asian name. And he winds up finding an actual food dish that he winds up taking as a name, which he realizes too late. He probably shouldn't have done, because that's just playing into the stereotype. But this episode is very racist. It is openly racist. And sure enough, when he says something, Brett accidentally walks into a gong, which causes it to go off. And that winds up becoming a recurring bit throughout the episode as well, where every time, Andre then proceeds to go on to explain that. But meanwhile, Reagan is trying to look for something that she can use as weapons to actually try and pry open information to eventually settling on a pair of earrings. But Brett pulls her away from that and tells her that obviously they need to stick together as a group, and decides to decide on their name, the Brett Pack, which of course she points out that they don't know when they would ever actually use that sort of information. But Brett says that the Brett Pack never says die, and then proceeds to pull them away. At which point we see Glenn and Gigi in their newfound quote unquote jobs. Glenn, of course, is very much being a stickler with the kids. And one of them stands up and says, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," which is of course a reference. And he tells them that it'll be their new substitute teacher, and then he tells them all to pipe down. But then one of the kids tells them that says that they won't listen to adults until they lift their ban on dancing, which of course Glenn isn't entirely sure about, because he doesn't fully understand how an entire town would put a ban on dancing. But he tells the kid he doesn't like his attitude, and then proceeds to physically push him against the wall, which the Price principal actually notices and comes in. But then we find out that he's not coming in to reprimand Glenn for assaulting a student, but actually encourages it, because it's the 80s, and that's a thing that's acceptable in that time period. Because we didn't know better in the 80s that child discipline that physical discipline was bad. We didn't know that. We do now. We didn't know back then. But in case Glenn is very happy about the fact that he gets to assault a student, and says God bless this decade. Meanwhile, Gigi goes to her news job, and she proceeds to walk in. And she proceeds to notice that everybody's asleep, and tells everybody to wake up. But when they don't wake up, she then proceeds to smash a coffee mug on one of the tables, and tells them that he got a missing persons case, and that's probably the most important story they're ever going to have. So for those reasons, she tells them that to hurry up. But one of the people in the newsroom tells them that they already got a hit story about how ice cream actually tastes moderately okay, which of course causes her to become upset, because obviously this is the 80s. She thinks they're all supposed to be on cocaine or something and actually have amazing stories. But of course one of the other reporters remarks that obviously this is the 80s, and obviously if there's no regularly smokable version of the cocaine that they can take, because they don't know that exists yet, and proceeds to tell them that they can't afford that on a reporter's salary. At which point Gigi realizes that she's going to need to help them get on track, and then proceeds to give them a whole bunch of lists that they need to write down, things that they need to write down to actually make a good news story, including the fact that of course they don't know that she makes a joke about how blind people are the only persons that should have dogs, but also the only people that are not allowed to have dogs, which of course is contradictory as hell, and that's the point. But she then proceeds to tell them that they're writing it down. In cases at this point where Brett then proceeds where everybody proceeds to reconvene in the house. And Brett wonders how everybody's day was, and what we find is that everybody's day was terrible. Obviously, Glenn got to punish kids all day, which was awesome for him, but he also pointed out that he had to babysit detention, which sucked a little bit more. So, yeah, he gave everybody detention, and then he had to babysit them in detention, which made him upset. Meanwhile, Gigi had to pull an entire 24-hour news cycle out of her ass, and which she points out wasn't pleasant. And then obviously, as we find out, Andre has had a very interesting day, because he found out the entire town is racist. So everybody keeps referring to him as Chinese when he's not Chinese. And obviously, he's very offended by that, but he also points out that the worst thing, and I've already pointed that out, is that every time he says something, a gong rings. And sure enough, as he says that, he hears a gong ring, and then he looks out of the window and asks who keeps doing that. And of course, everybody's happy about that. But then Reagan proceeds to pull out a device that she has finally finished, pointing out that it'll actually enable them to track Mike. And then proceeds to show everybody what she's made and that she's MacGyvered a device to do that. Which of course is again just one of those things that she points out. She doesn't know, but she also should know. But in case she then proceeds to pull out the device and shows it to everybody. But Brett tells them that now it's the only time to find that. But she tells them that everybody that's now time to find Mike and get out of this town. But Brett tells them that they're not going to do that, and that they're going to stay. They actually just wants to actually sit down and watch the growing years with them first. Which of course she points out is kind of counterintuitive, because she doesn't really connect with anything. She wants to actually get out of this town as quickly as possible, and tells them that finding Mike is actually the best way forward. But at which point she asks why Brett has been so clingy lately, because obviously he's been like this ever since they got there, and of course Brett points out that he just wants to spend time with everybody and connect with them outside of work. But of course, she points out that obviously she feels like that's not really an appropriate real thing, because obviously they're people. They have their own lives going on. They don't want to just connect with Brett literally all the time. And of course, this eventually causes Brett to become upset, and then proceeds to blow up at Reagan, because she points out that because she didn't grow up with anything, she obviously does not have any sort of connection to any of the things that everybody else likes, which of course causes her to become pissed off, and she then proceeds to point out that it's all pointless stuff anyway, and then proceeds to call Ghostbusters stupid, which of course causes him to become upset, and he runs out and then remarks that he's disappointed that they came out of the same room, even though Reagan points out that was actually just their cover. And Gigi decides to take that one step further, pointing out that she raised her better than that, which, of course, that didn't happen either, but it's kind of funny. But in case the rest of the gang then proceeds to actually go to Kevin's house, where Kevin and his group have quickly realized that Mike isn't really a good alien; he's just a dick. So, of course, they've quickly figured out that he's not actually nice, and that they're actually going to need to find a way to get rid of them, and wonders if the government actually did came and take him away, if President Reagan would actually give them a reward. And there's of course is at this point where Mike somewhat tries to remember something, but he then proceeds to realize that because he obviously knows who Reagan is, but he knows a Reagan, not the Reagan, but a Reagan. But of course he doesn't remember, and of course at this point where the gang tells him that he needs to leave and they needs to get out, and that they're actually sick of him loafing around eating all their food and doing nothing. So at which point Mike tries to play into the sympathy by claiming that their Earth atmosphere is toxic to him, and of course they point out that and it also tells them that if they want to help him, that they're going to have to take him back to the place where they found him, but which they don't want to do initially, but then he forces them to drag, because again he's pretending that oxygen is toxic to him, and of course they eventually realize that they have no choice and drag him back to the bikes. As the rest of the department heads from Incognito Inc. arrive and start looking around the shop. And start looking around the house looking for him, but they can't find him. And of course, at this point when they realize they can't find Mike, that Reagan realizes now that they realize that Brett is she realizes after spending some time apart that she needs to figure out how to make up with Brett, and she points out that obviously she doesn't fully understand how she's going to do that. And she points out because obviously Brett and her. Well, obviously, she points out that obviously she feels like that the only way that she's not going to be able to connect with him unless she knows all the things he knows. So, and Glenn points out that that's obviously something he agrees with. So, he then proceeds to pull out his Blockbuster card, which apparently he keeps, even though Blockbuster is mostly a defunct company. I think there's like one brick and mortar store still up, but yeah, apparently Glenn still has a Blockbuster membership card, so he gives it to Reagan and tells her to go catch up on all the things that Brett missed. Well, they continue to go and look for. Mike. Although Glenn warns her that he doesn't want to see any rewind fees. At which point she thanks Glenn and proceeds to go off. All the rest of the department heads proceed to look into what's going on with where Mike could have possibly gone. And then proceed to decide to go into town. Meanwhile, Brett decides to go to the Nostalgia Max chemicals, the chemicals that they use to mind wipe everybody, and decides that if he has just a little bit, he'll be able to make everybody forget that they're from the 21st century, I guess. I don't know centuries, and decides that they'll want to stay in the 80s forever. But in the process, he accidentally breaks it, and it winds up spilling on top of him, as well as a couple of old toys, and it's at this point where Brett gains psychic powers and becomes super powerful, and because we find out he suffers an overdose of it, and he then gains the ability to actually control everything from the 80s. Meanwhile, the kids have actually started to escort Mike back to where he came from. And of course they pointed out that Mike, and of course Kevin then proceeds to have a go on Mike, because obviously he points out that they obviously don't see eye to eye with each other, and points out that obviously Mike has been a dick to him the whole time, and of course Mike calls him out on his attitude, and then tells him that that's why his dad left, which causes Kevin to finally snap, and he then proceeds to yeet Kevin off a cliff, where he proceeds to actually wind up landing on top of the car that the rest of the department heads are driving, who conveniently are trying to track him and wind up being in the exact spot where he winds up landing, and that winds up fixing his memory issues, and he then proceeds to remember who all the department heads are, and then proceeds to tell them that he hates them, because of course he does. At which point he notices that somebody's missing, and they point out that it's obviously Brett. It's obviously Brett, and then they see Brett floating around in a giant cloud of Nostalgia Max and old toys, and of course they conclude that, and of course it's at this point where Mike realizes that they're standing right behind him, so he turns around and starts looking and realizes that he's floating right behind him, and then Reagan and then Brett then proceeds to try and assemble all of his toy army to try and keep everybody pinned in place. Meanwhile, Reagan has arrived at Blockbuster and remarks that she's going to watch, well, pretty much everything. So that's kind of the point that she's going to try and just binge watch everything from the 80s, and she does that. She proceeds to pull up 10 TV shows, 10 TV channels, puts in VHSs for pretty much everything in pretty much every slot that she can, and winds up binge watching everything. But after watching all the must-watch stuff, she wonders why Brett is so obsessed with the decade, because she still doesn't fully understand it. At which point she proceeds to remove another VHS tape in, and then sees a video of the growing years, which she quickly realizes was Brett's family that she made in the Pretendo deck, and quickly realizing that he was actually using a fake family. She finally realizes that he was using this to cope for his own family life, and of course the store owner doesn't fully understand what she's talking about, so and she doesn't even bother to explain it. At which point she sees what's going on with Brett outside, and then proceeds to whip up an old and homemade Ghostbusters proton cannon, and proceeds to fight back against Brett and his hypnotic things, but of course, by this point, Brett is extremely powerful, and Glenn also wonders how long she was in Blockbuster for, but she merely responds, "Enough time to make the thing she made." And of course, she then proceeds to pull out the giant proton pack and shoot it at Brett, but Brett uses one of his mind control toys to actually dismantle it, and proceeds to pin her against the clock tower. And at which point she proceeds to point out that he doesn't need to do this, and that she understands why things have gone wrong, and she knows from personal experience that family life can suck, and then points out that he shouldn't be completely blinded by the fact that his own family life sucks, and proceeds to kind of sort of hand him the tape of growing years, which she pulls out and tells him to remember what his old family life was like. And he proceeds to use his psychic powers to go grab it again, and of course, after looking at the VHS tape for a while, we then proceed to get a flashback where we find out Brett's family just fucking hated him for no real reason, apparently. As we find out, Brett just didn't, as we find out. Brett's family is a very rich, very wealthy family, and not only would they actively exclude him from family photos, but as we find out, they also treated him as a bit of a loser because he wasn't rich or successful like the rest of his family. And then also his parents never bothered to actually show up for his birthday party at one point, which of course the butler tells him that they were extending a trip. And also that his brothers weren't even going to be there either because they were in boarding school / rehab, respectively. And of course, Brett very sad about how nobody came to his birthday, specifically his family. He then proceeds to see a video of the growing years on his TV, and that's how he wound up coping for his own family, for his own shortcomings in his own family. And of course, at this point where he remembers that. His family kind of sucks, but and Marianne points out that she can sympathize because her own family life sucks, but that he doesn't really need to actually just recapture the magic of his family and his childhood because he's already got his best work family for life, and he decides that that's absolutely something she should cherish, and then proceeds to let go of his psychic powers and let go of his nostalgia for the 80s, and then proceeds to point out that. They actually sit down. That obviously he doesn't need to. That he obviously doesn't need to actually just hold on to his past anymore. He can just be more open about the fact that his family life sucked. And of course Reagan then proceeds to pull him into a hug. At which point Kevin and his friends, they show up and realize that Mike is also completely fine, and wonders if that means he's going home, and of course Mike points out that he is, and then proceeds to pull an ET telling him that he'll be right there, but then he just pushes Kevin off his bike and tells him that's for throwing him off the cliff. At which point the gang then say that now it's time for them to go back to the 2020s, but this of course causes everybody in the town to become confused and wonder if they're time travelers, and Frankie just decides to go with it so that they don't wind up blowing the operation, and of course everybody then proceeds to remark that they actually want to go back to the one perfect decade of the 1950s, and Brett realizes that it's not just him, everybody has a decade that they idealize, and they finally realize that yes, nostalgia is in fact a thing, and at which point they proceed to go home, and Reagan is at which point they decide to go home, and Reagan decides to treat him to both a family dinner and a movie night. And of course Brett, they wind up getting pizza, and Brett winds up picking the Goonies. And what we find out is that it actually has not aged well because they're mentally challenged brothers chained up in the basement in that movie. If you've never seen the Goonies, that's it. But that's how the episode ends. But in case. Yeah, this episode is very much about Brett's home life and about how terrible it was. And now we know, and it's actually kind of a miracle that Brett turned out the way he did as a happy-go-lucky, I'm gonna be everybody's friend type person, when his own family didn't even like him. That's kind of mean and sad. But Brett was very much grew up as using the 80s as a coping mechanism, and that's a little bit sad and depressing. But it does kind of paint a little bit more of a picture about Brett's character. It now makes sense why he's so happy and likable to everybody. It's because his own family didn't like him, and he's trying to make up for that with everybody else. So yeah, that's kind of a wholesome thing to take away from that. But in any case, that's gonna do it for my review of Inside Job. What you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Patreon as well. It helps fund future projects. Please go check those out. And also be sure to go and check out my Twitch. I stream on weekends, Saturday and Sunday. Please go check those out. I would very much appreciate it if you did that. Be sure to go check those things out. I would very much appreciate if everyone was able to just help and support me that way, because I'm trying to push for Twitch affiliate over there, and I would very much appreciate it if you did. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.